The morning Grace Whitfield gave up her seat on the bus to help a crying stranger carry a stroller up 3 flights of stairs at a broken elevator, she missed the only job interview she'd had in 4 months. She didn't even get to explain. The receptionist at Holt Briar Financial told her, politely but firmly, that Mr. Briar didn't wait for candidates who couldn't arrive on time, that the position had already moved to the next round, that she could reapply next year if she was still interested. Grace stood outside the revolving glass door of the building on Bay Street in Toronto, her heels damp from the March slush, her resume folder tucked under her arm, and she stared at the bronze Holt Briar plaque on the wall for a long moment. Then she walked to the nearest Tim Hortons, ordered a medium double-double, and allowed herself exactly 7 minutes to feel sorry about it before getting on with her day. That was Grace, always 7 minutes, never more. She'd grown up in a house in Oshawa where self-pity was considered a luxury nobody could afford. Her mother, Brenda, had raised Grace and her 2 younger brothers on a nurse's aide salary after their father left when Grace was 9. Brenda Whitfield was not the kind of woman who cried about spilled milk. She was the kind of woman who mopped it up, figured out why the carton was leaking, and called the landlord about the broken refrigerator seal. Grace had inherited all of that, and she'd carried it with her like a second spine for 28 years. She had a finance degree from Ryerson, 3 years of bookkeeping experience at a mid-sized accounting firm that had folded during a bad quarter, and a bright, detailed mind that her old boss Gerald had called wasted on spreadsheets. What she didn't have was a connection, a name, or the kind of easy confidence that came from never having to worry about next month's rent. The job at Holt Briar would have changed that. It paid nearly twice what she'd been making. It had benefits. It had a pension plan. She'd been preparing for the interview for 2 weeks, had practiced her answers in the bathroom mirror each morning, had pressed her best blazer the night before, and laid it out on the chair by her bedroom door, like it was the first day of school. And then she'd seen a young woman on the Yonge University line, maybe 23, 24, sobbing quietly while wrestling a heavy stroller through the turnstile. A toddler stood next to her, gripping her coat, looking up at her mother's face with the particular helplessness of a child who doesn't know what's wrong but knows something is. The elevator, the usual one, was out of service. There was a note taped to it, in Arial font, temporarily unicavable. Sorry for the inconvenience. Grace had looked at her watch. She'd looked at the woman. She'd looked at the stairs. Then she'd grabbed the front of the stroller and said, "I've got this end." It took longer than expected. The stroller was heavier than it looked. The young woman, her name was Kezia, she'd said it twice, like she wanted Grace to know, had cried the whole way up, thanking her in fragments between tears. Her partner had just left, she'd explained. Last night. Just like that. She had a job interview of her own in an hour, and hadn't slept and hadn't eaten, and didn't know what she was going to do with Marcus, the toddler, who had the solemn wide eyes of a child, already learning that the world was complicated. By the time Grace had helped Kezia out to street level and into a cab, and pressed her last $20 into her hand for the fare, because Kezia had lost her transit card, and her wallet was in the bag under the stroller, and she was shaking too hard to search for it. Grace had missed her interview by 14 minutes. She had thought later, sitting in Tim Hortons with her double-double going lukewarm, that she didn't regret it, but she'd be lying if she said it didn't hurt. What happened next took Grace almost a week to understand. On Thursday, 4 days after the interview, she received a call from a number she didn't recognize. A woman's voice, warm but precise, the kind of voice that was accustomed to being listened to. "Is this Grace Whitfield?" "It is. My name is Owen Holt. I believe you had an interview with our firm this week that you were unable to attend." Grace's hand tightened around the phone. "I did. I apologize for that. I understand the position has moved on." "It has," Eleanor Holt said, "but I'm not calling about that position." There was a brief pause, measured and deliberate. Grace had the sense that this woman did very few things by accident. "I was on the Yonge line last Monday morning," Eleanor continued. "I was in the car behind you when you helped that young woman with the stroller. I watched the whole thing." Another pause, including you giving her your cab fare. Grace didn't say anything. She wasn't sure what to say. "I do the same commute every week," Eleanor said. "In 22 years, I've watched dozens of people walk past that elevator sign without a second glance. I've done it myself, I'll admit. I was running late too that morning." Something in her voice shifted, not softer exactly, but more honest. "You were the only one who stopped. She needed help," Grace said simply. "Yes," Eleanor Holt said. "She did." Grace would learn, over the following days, that Eleanor Holt was not merely the founding partner of Holt Briar Financial. She was also the woman who had, some 30 years ago, arrived in Toronto from Montreal with $60 and a borrowed suitcase, and built one of the most respected boutique investment firms in the country through a combination of ferocious intelligence and what her colleagues called an uncanny ability to read people. She had a reputation in the industry for being exacting and unsentimental. She expected the best from everyone around her, and she was not known for second chances. She was offering Grace something that was not, technically, a second chance. It was something else entirely. "I have a project," Eleanor said. "A complex financial restructuring for a family business that's in trouble. I need someone detail-oriented, discreet, and able to work under pressure. The person I'd intended to assign it to has taken a leave of absence." She paused. "I'm not offering you the junior analyst position you interviewed for. I'm offering you something temporary, but more substantial. If you perform well, we can discuss permanent arrangements." Grace had asked, very calmly, if she could have 24 hours to think about it. Eleanor Holt had laughed. It was a short, surprised laugh, like she hadn't expected it. "Of course," she said. Grace spent the 24 hours doing exactly what Grace always did. She researched. She pulled every article about Holt Briar she could find, read Eleanor Holt's professional profile 3 times, cross-referenced the firm's public filings, and tried to understand what she was actually walking into. She called her friend Preet, who worked in Bay Street Law, and asked her what she knew about the firm. "It's legit," Preet said. "Eleanor Holt is the real deal, terrifying, but the real deal. Why?" "She offered me a contract position." There was a silence on the other end of the line. "Grace, say yes." She said yes. Her first week at Holt Briar was disorienting in the way that all genuinely new things are disorienting. Not because anything went wrong, but because almost nothing was what she'd expected. The office was quieter than she'd imagined. No shouting, no theatrical urgency, no scenes from a financial thriller. It was a place of concentrated effort, where people spoke in low voices, and the coffee was always fresh, and the windows overlooked a gray Toronto morning with something close to dignity. Eleanor Holt ran the firm with the kind of quiet authority that never needed to raise its voice. She was in her mid-60s, trim and elegant, with silver hair cut to her chin and a habit of watching people for just a beat longer than was comfortable, as if she was always measuring something. She was not warm in the way that made you feel immediately at ease. But she was fair, and that, Grace would come to understand, was worth more. Grace's assignment was clear. Assess the financial situation of a company called Ashgrove Holdings, a mid-sized construction and real estate development firm that had run into serious difficulties after an overextended project in the Ottawa market had gone sideways. The goal was to identify what could be salvaged and what needed to be restructured before the company's creditors lost patience. She buried herself in the files. Late nights at her desk, early mornings on the subway with her laptop, weekends rereading contracts and cross-checking numbers. The work was harder than anything she'd done at her old firm, and more interesting. There were problems she'd never encountered before, decisions that turned on details she had to teach herself. She liked the weight of it. What she hadn't anticipated was the other Holt. She met him on a Wednesday, in the 3rd week of her contract. She was in the small conference room on the 4th floor, going through a stack of Ashgrove's project reports, when the door opened without a knock. A man walked in carrying a coffee and a phone, already halfway through what appeared to be a deeply unpleasant thought. He stopped when he saw her. He was tall, mid-30s, with the kind of face that would have been handsome if it hadn't been arranged in such a guarded expression. Dark jacket, no tie. The general air of someone who had decided long ago that his time was more valuable than yours, and was not particularly apologetic about it. "Who are you?" he said. "Grace Whitfield. I'm working on the Ashgrove restructuring." He looked at her the way someone looks at a chair that's been moved to the wrong side of the room. Not angry, exactly, just recalibrating. "This is my conference room," he said. "I was told it was available on Wednesdays." "By whom?" "Your mother." Something moved behind his eyes. He took a slow sip of his coffee, still watching her, and then pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, apparently deciding she wasn't going to move and that this wasn't worth a scene. His name was Owen Holt, Eleanor's son. He'd joined the firm 2 years ago after a decade running his own development company, which had been successful enough that he'd sold it and come home, as far as Grace could tell, not because he needed to, but because Eleanor had asked him to, and it seemed Owen Holt was not entirely capable of saying no to his mother, whatever the expression on his face suggested. He was, in the language of the office, brilliant and difficult. He got results. He also had opinions about how things should be done, and he expressed them without a great deal of interest in whether the other person found the delivery pleasant. Grace had heard him on a phone call in the hallway 2 days earlier and had made a quiet mental note to avoid him. That plan lasted exactly as long as it took Eleanor to reassign the Ashgrove file as a joint project. Owen knows the development side of things better than anyone in this office, Eleanor told Grace the following morning. And you understand the financial architecture. Together you'll move faster. Does he know? Grace asked. Eleanor smiled, that small, composed smile that gave nothing away. He will. The first joint meeting was polite in the way that cold fronts are polite before they become weather. Owen arrived 3 minutes late, set his coffee down without comment, and opened his copy of the Ashgrove file to a page he'd clearly already marked up in red. He went straight to business, which Grace respected even when she disagreed with his conclusions. The Ottawa project is a write-off, he said. We shouldn't be trying to salvage it. The carrying costs alone are eating the company. Partially, Grace said. He looked up. Excuse me? The Ottawa project is partially a write-off. There are 2 contracts within that project that are still viable if the timeline is renegotiated. She slid the relevant pages across the table. If we restructure the payment schedule here and here, and bring in a new general contractor to replace the one they've lost, the northern residential block is still profitable. Owen looked at the pages. He looked at them for longer than she expected. How'd you find that? He said. I read everything. The other analyst who looked at this called the whole Ottawa project dead. The other analyst was looking at the project summary, Grace said. I looked at the individual contracts. Another silence. Owen picked up the papers and read them properly this time. Grace waited. Okay, he said finally. Walk me through it. She walked him through it. He interrupted twice with sharp, specific questions. Good questions. The kind that made her think, rather than putting her on the defensive. She answered them directly. He made notes. By the end of the hour, they had the outline of an approach that was more than either of them had come in with. He didn't say thank you. He did say, as he gathered his things, same time Thursday, which, Grace suspected, was as close as Owen Holt got to a compliment. She found out about the sabotage on a Friday afternoon, which felt appropriate. Bad things, in Grace's experience, had a preference for Fridays. She'd been about to send a revised version of the Ashgrove financial model to Eleanor when she noticed that 3 of the key formulas were wrong. Not subtly wrong. Wrong in a way that would have made the entire analysis look unreliable. Overstated liabilities, understated assets, the kind of errors that would have made a senior partner doubt her competence entirely. She had not made those errors. She was certain of it the way she was certain of her own name. She went back through the version history and found it. At 11:47 on Thursday night, someone had accessed her shared drive folder and made changes to the working file. She wasn't supposed to have access to the version history on this system. She'd stumbled onto it by accident 6 days earlier when she was trying to find an earlier draft, and she very quietly did not mention that she had it. She fixed the file. She saved the corrupted version separately, time-stamped, and she sat for a moment with her hands flat on her desk, thinking carefully. There were 3 people at the firm who had access to that folder. Herself, Owen, and a senior analyst named Randall, who had made his feelings about Grace's appointment known in several small, deniable ways since her first week, arriving at meetings with outdated information she'd already corrected, CCing others on emails that didn't require it, using a particular tone of patient condescension when he spoke to her, as if he were waiting for her to finally prove what he already believed about her. She didn't go to Eleanor. Not yet. Instead, she built her case quietly, the way her mother had always said to do things worth doing, carefully and without making noise until you were sure. Owen found out before Eleanor did. He noticed the discrepancy himself in a different part of the file. When he was cross-checking numbers late on a Saturday morning from his home office, he called Grace. Someone changed the Ashgrove model, he said when she picked up. I know, she said. A pause. You know, I found it Friday. I've already corrected it and kept a copy of the modified version with the timestamp. Another pause. Longer this time. Randall, he said. I don't have proof of who, Grace said carefully. I do. I know his patterns. His voice had gone flat and quiet, the way water goes flat just before it gets cold. He's done variations of this before. With junior staff he wants gone. I didn't think he'd try it with someone on a direct file from my mother. Maybe he thought it would look like my error, Grace said. It would have, Owen said. If you hadn't caught it. She heard him exhale slowly on the other end of the phone. Why didn't you come to me? He said. Because I didn't have proof yet, she said. And because it wasn't your problem to fix. There was something in the silence that followed that she couldn't quite name. She thought of him in the conference room that first day, looking at her like a chair in the wrong place. She thought of Thursday, the way he'd asked her questions, real ones, not performance ones, and taken notes. She thought of how he never said thank you but always came back. It is now, he said. What happened to Randall was handled quietly and without drama, which was the Holt Briar way. He resigned. The official reason given was a personal decision to pursue other opportunities. Grace suspected Eleanor Holt had given him a choice and he'd taken it. She didn't ask. It wasn't her business. What was her business was the presentation she and Owen gave to Ashgrove's board of directors 3 weeks later. In a boardroom on the 41st floor of a King Street tower, on a gray afternoon when the lake was the color of pewter outside the windows. They'd divided the sections between them without anyone suggesting it, as if the division had always been obvious. Owen handled the development analysis and the restructuring timeline. Grace presented the financial model and the revised contract framework. The board asked hard questions. They answered them. Owen, at one point, deferred to Grace on a figure she'd sourced from a contract detail he hadn't read. He did it without hesitation, just pointed at her across the table and said, Grace found that. She can speak to it better than I can. It was such a small thing. It did not feel small. The board voted to proceed with the restructuring plan. A handshake across the table, the quiet release of tension that follows a genuine accomplishment, and then the elevator ride back down with their folders, and Toronto stretching out gray and enormous around them. Owen held the lobby door for her on the way out. She noticed because it was the kind of thing she had learned, over the years, to pay attention to. Eleanor invited her for coffee the following Monday, not in a conference room, but at a small place around the corner from the office that Eleanor apparently used for conversations she didn't want conducted on firm property. It was a narrow, warm room that smelled of roasted coffee and old wood, the kind of place that had been exactly this for 30 years and had no plans to become anything else. Eleanor was already seated when Grace arrived. She had a black coffee and the expression of someone who knows exactly what they want to say and is taking a moment to consider the order. Owen told me about the file, Eleanor said. I thought he might. He also told me he found out from you, not the other way around, that you'd already corrected it and documented it and were waiting until you had more. She held her cup in both hands and watched Grace over the rim. Most people in your position would have gone straight to a partner the moment they found it. Most people in my position wouldn't have had anything to go straight with, Grace said. One corrupted file and a hunch about who did it isn't a case, it's a complaint. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, What do you want? Professionally. Not what you're willing to accept, what do you actually want? It was the kind of question Grace had learned to be cautious with, because people who asked it didn't always want a real answer. But Eleanor Holt was watching her with that steady, measuring look, and Grace had the sense that she had earned a real answer, and that giving a careful non-answer would be its own kind of failure. I want to do work that matters, Grace said. I want to be in a room where the decisions are real, not where I'm explaining someone else's decisions to a client. I want to build something, a practice, a specialty, something that lasts past next quarter. She paused. And I want to be paid fairly for it. Eleanor smiled. It was different from her usual smile, broader and unexpectedly warm. Good, she said, because I'm offering you a permanent position. Not junior analyst, senior associate with a path to partner in 3 years if your work continues as it has. She set down her cup. I've been looking for someone for a long time, Grace. Most of the people I interview have ambition without judgment, or judgment without backbone. You seem to have all three. Grace sat with it for a moment. Outside, a streetcar ground past on King Street, and the coffee machine behind the counter hissed. Toronto doing what Toronto always did, enormous and indifferent and full of possibility. "I'd like that very much," she said. She didn't see Owen that week, which was unusual. He was in Vancouver for client meetings, she gathered, though she gathered this from the office calendar and not from him. He texted her on Thursday. She wasn't expecting it. "Good coffee on Robson Street. Thought of you for some reason." She stared at it for a moment, unsure what she was supposed to do with it. "That's a very specific reason," she typed back. "You mentioned once you missed good coffee when you travel. I don't know if you travel for work. I just remembered it." She thought about that for a while, long enough that the cursor blinked at her and she put the phone face down on her desk and went back to her numbers. Then she picked it up again. "I've accepted Eleanor's offer. Permanent position." The reply came fast, which she noticed. "I know. She told me. I'm glad." Then a few minutes later, "You earned it. The Ashgrove board was asking about you after we left." Then a minute after that, "I'm back Friday. There's a client dinner Monday. Would you want to come?" She looked at her screen for a long moment. The office was quiet around her. Outside, the March light had that particular quality it sometimes got in Toronto. Gray but not unkind, the city mid-breath between winter and something else. "Yes," she typed. "I'd want to come." Months later, when people asked Grace how she'd ended up at Holt Briar, she would tell them the short version: a referral, an opportunity, the usual turns of a career. She didn't explain about Kezia and the stroller and the broken elevator, because it felt too strange to explain, and also because she wasn't sure explanation was the point. Her mother, Brenda, had a different way of putting it. "You were going where you were always going," Brenda said. When Grace tried to explain the whole chain of things one Sunday afternoon in Oshawa, sitting at the kitchen table where Grace had done her homework for 18 years. "The girl on the subway just showed you the road. That's not really how it works, Mum." Brenda picked up her tea. "Maybe not. But you know what I've never seen in all my years? I've never seen a person who genuinely helps people without wanting something in return end up having a bad life." She looked at her daughter in that direct, unornamented way she had. Not a bad long life, anyway. Grace thought about that on the drive back to Toronto. She thought about Kezia, who she'd looked for on the subway a few times and never found. She thought about Randall and the corrupted file, and Eleanor's small, composed smile. She thought about Owen on a Thursday afternoon asking hard questions and writing down the answers. She thought about the 7 minutes she'd allowed herself outside Tim Hortons in the March slush, and how she hadn't known then that the thing she thought she'd lost was not the thing she was after. She turned onto the 401 and let the city pull her back in, all of it. The gray lake, the morning commute, the revolving glass doors, the cold coffee going warm on a desk where something was being built that was hers. She had never been the kind of person who believed in fate, but she believed in paying attention. She believed in stopping when stopping was the right thing, even when you were running late, even when the elevator was out of service, even when the stroller was heavier than it looked. She believed that those moments added up, quietly, without announcement. She had stopped on the stairs. The rest, it turned out, was already on its way.